Welcome to the Equipping You in Grace podcast. We are so excited that you are joining us for the show today. This podcast aims to explore a biblical life view in a conversational tone. Let's join our host and founder of Servants of Grace, Dave Jenkins, for today's episode. Thanks so much for listening.
Welcome back to the Equipping You in Grace podcast. My name is Dave, and I'm the host of this podcast. And with me today, I have Ben. Ben, welcome to the Equipping You in Grace podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you. Can you tell us a little bit, Ben, about your life, marriage, ministry, and some of the current ministry projects that you're working on?
Sure, I'd be glad to. I grew up in Jackson, Mississippi, went to Mississippi State University. From there, I went to Reformed Theological Seminary in Jackson, where I received an outstanding MDiv. And at the same time, I met my wife, Christy, there. At the end of that time, I started thinking about doctoral work, and I was initially interested in John Bunyan and his pastoral theology. And through that, kind of migrated from Bunyan in the 17th century to Thomas Boston in the 18th century. And in the 18th century, I encountered some biographies written by this guy named J.C. Ryle about some leaders of the evangelical revival, and became fascinated with him, and ultimately went on to Southern Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky, to do a PhD in church history and focused on J.C. Ryle. My wife and I think we mentioned this a moment ago, just celebrated our 13th anniversary on June the 6th. We have two kids, two wonderful guys, Henry Ryle Rogers, who is 7, and Hugh Thomas Rogers, who is 4. I currently pastor a small church, a New Home Baptist Church, which is in Mendel, which is just about 50 miles south of Jackson. And I teach Bible and Latin at Christ Covenant School. And that's what I've been up to. I'm currently working, editing and introducing a new edition of Ryle's book on preaching, Simplicity, which is due to be out in September. And after that, I want to return to John Bunyan and think about John Bunyan's pastoral theology, particularly the pastoral theology of the Pilgrim's Progress. And so I hope to begin work on that this summer and get finished with it maybe within a year, but not quite sure. Since I teach school, life accelerates considerably when we get started, and so usually my writing and study time is diminished considerably during that time.
Well, those sound like very fascinating projects, in particular John Bunyan's pastoral theology. I'll be excited to read that for sure.
Well, he's a delight to, the Pilgrim's Progress, as you know, is such a rich book, and it's full of pastoral theology if you've got the eyes to see it. That's really what I want to explore in the coming weeks and months.
Wonderful. Well, can you please tell us about your book, A Tender Lion, The Life, Ministry, and Message of J.C. Ryle, why you wrote it, and how is it being received so far?
Sure. Well, I wrote it because as I got to know Ryle better, I realized a couple things. One, that he had been underappreciated as a subject of historical inquiry. So if you look at his peer, Charles Spurgeon, a name that would be well known to all your listeners, when he died, roughly 18 or 19 biographies were written about him in the year he died. Since Ryle's death in 1900, only about half that many had been written about him, and he was considered the Anglican Spurgeon. And so Ryle was a figure who I thought deserved more attention than he got. And as I got to know him better, I realized he's such a fascinating figure. He's involved in everything in the Victorian church, and so he is a great person to get to know personally, ministerially, but he also gives us a great insight into all that's going on in the Victorian church world. So that's why I got into how I became interested in Ryle, and that's why I wrote this work. This work was originally my doctoral dissertation, and we cleaned it up and got it ready for a more popular audience last year, and it came out in January or February of this year, and I think it's been received well. From what I hear from Reformation Heritage Books, it's done well, so it's been a great blessing to get to know Ryle and to help others get to know him as well.
Yeah, well, it doesn't read like a doctoral dissertation, so that's good.
That is good.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. I've read quite a bit of Ryle's work. As I mentioned before we recorded, I've read Holiness probably a handful of times at least, and I've read The Simplicity in Preaching, his work to young men. I don't even remember how I was thinking as you were talking about how did I get into that. I don't even know. Find Ryle probably through reading Spurgeon and others, John Bunyan, Thomas Goodwin. I started reading these guys probably in my 20s, maybe before. Right. I don't really remember. I'd probably have to really rack my brain, about that. But I really appreciated your book. I appreciate the way it's laid out. It's easy to read. It's accessible, and I enjoyed it. So
well, great. One of the things I think about Ryle is that if you like the Puritans, you'll love Ryle, because Ryle takes Puritan theology, Puritan spirituality, and he puts it in direct, accessible, modern English. So when you read Holiness, like you've done, and many of your listeners will have done, now just look at the footnotes. It's John Owen, it's John Bunyan, it's just a whole host of it's the who's who of the Puritans, and Ryle has read them, he's digested them, and he's communicated their ideas in a simple, forceful, clear, winsome way. And so that's one of the reasons I think Holiness has done so well, because he has distilled Puritan spirituality, Protestant theology, and communicated it as clearly, I think, as anyone does, especially in his generation, to a whole new audience. And the Puritans were incredibly unpopular in Ryle's day. I mean, Ryle's contemporaries associated Puritans with regicides, with king killers, and no monarch has been more popular than Victoria was. So, Ryle was popularizing Puritans, writing about Puritans in a day when Puritans were not well liked. And even Ryle's evangelical contemporaries in magazines like the Christian Observer criticize his fascination, his love of Puritans. They like his emphasis on the Reformers. They dislike his interest and his emphasis on the Puritans, who they tend to regard as radicals, enthusiasts, and king killers.
Isn't that interesting? Because where did the Puritans get their ideas? They got it from the Reformers, not the other way around. Right. So that's interesting. That's interesting.
It is.
Who exactly is J.C. Ryle?
J.C. Ryle, such an interesting figure. His grandfather got rich in the silk trade at the end of the 18th century. He lived in Macclesfield, England, so think northwest England. And his grandfather was just he's somebody who deserves a doctoral dissertation about. He was a close friend of John Wesley, and John Wesley preached from his doorstep in open air to large congregations in Macclesfield. And just a remarkable man, a spiritual giant. I think he was the first Methodist mayor in England. So just a public servant, a devout evangelical. But his father, Ryle's father, inherited that love of public service, certainly that love of business, but not his spirituality. And so Ryle, despite his grandfather's deep spirituality, grew up in a rather unspiritual home. And he lived there, he grew up there, he went on to Eton and Oxford, where he distinguished himself as both an athlete and a scholar. At the end of his time at Oxford, he experienced an evangelical conversion, a very famous one now. He was studying for his final exams or for his honors examinations. He was very downcast and discouraged. He walked into a church that he couldn't even remember later on in life, and heard someone read, the lector read Ephesians 2, 8 and 9 in a very remarkable way. And he said that was it. That was the moment when, that was either the moment of his conversion or the closing in of his conversion. He would say in his autobiography that, by the end of the year, he was a Christian. And in another place, he said he was actually converted in that service. And that sent his life in a somewhat different trajectory than it was going. He was headed into politics before that time. His father was wealthy. He was an heir to that extensive estate. And it was just assumed he was going to follow his father in business, go into politics. But then his father went bankrupt. And if you've ever watched, or read a Jane Austen novel or know anything about that world, this is an era before limited liability. So if you went bankrupt, everything had to be sold. Your house wasn't protected. Even your clothes weren't protected. And so everything had to be liquidated. And not only did they lose money, but the loss of status was almost equally as devastating. So at that time, people who went bankrupt were considered crooks and thieves. And so Ryle's social connections were severed. His political career was over before it started. And so he just says, well, I was shut up to going into the church. So he went into the ministry of the Church of England. Now Ryle's story is not one that I would commend to people considering entering the ministry. I'm not sure that's the pattern of the paradigm that we should encourage, but nonetheless, God did amazing things with him. He was a curate in New Forest, out in the middle of nowhere. The director of the church that he served was gone for about half the time, and so Ryle was preaching about 4 times a week. And you got to remember, he wasn't planning to go to the ministry. He hadn't been trained as a preacher, and so his early preaching was terrible by his own admission, and he tried all these pulpit experiments. He tried imitating the famous ministers of his day and tried preaching those sort of sermons in that sort of style to agricultural laborers, and they just went straight to sleep. And so Ryle, through a process of trial and error, found his voice, learned to be simple, short, direct, clear, and by the time he figured that out, he was filling up the church every single week. He moved from New Forest to Winchester, ultimately landing in Helmingham, and that's when Ryle became a more national figure. So think the mid-1840s to 1860 or 1861, that's when his writing career began. He began reading the Puritans extensively because he had more free time on his hands. He was preaching not only in his church and filling it up, but being invited to preach in other places, and making a name for himself by writing tracts. So that's initially how Ryle came to fame as a writer, is he wrote evangelical tracts. Now, when you hear tract, or at least when I hear tract, I think of, those things that sometimes people will give to a waiter at a restaurant, right? Those, they're trifold little sheets of paper that have a simple gospel message that's probably, 200 words long, something like that. That's not a tract that Ryle was writing. Ryle was writing 60-page tracts, 90-page tracts, 30-page tracts. And if you've ever read Ryle's books like Holiness, or Old Paths, or Practical Religion, or Knots Untied, or books of that nature, The Upper Room, all of those are examples of tracts that Ryle wrote and then were later kind of repackaged in book form. And 1860s, he's kind of moving up in terms of the Church of England's evangelical party. He's moving up the ranks. He goes to a place called Stradbroke in 1861 and is there until he becomes Bishop of Liverpool. When he comes to Stradbroke, that's when his ministry becomes a national player. So he is no longer just a influential evangelical voice. He is the influential evangelical voice in the Church of England. So he is involved in every controversy, every fight, every debate, and he's usually the leading voice, the leading man for his party. And in 1880, he becomes the first Bishop of Liverpool, which it's hard to... I try in the book to let the reader know something of the monumental task in front of him. I mean, by the time he gets there, he is in charge of 1.2 million souls with, I think, 400 ministers at his disposal. And Liverpool, by all accounts, was the worst of the industrial towns of the industrial age in terms of crime, in terms of poverty, in terms of drunkenness, and all sorts of just social ills. Liverpool had them all to the excess. And so Ryle, as the first bishop, tried to figure out how do you provide pastoral and ministerial oversight to this many people under these circumstances. And so that's what he spent the last 20 years of his life doing, with limited resources, with constant criticism, facing all sorts of personal challenges as well. And he passed away, went on to be with the Lord in 1900. So I think maybe that's more than you wanted, but it's a sketch of Ryle's life, I hope from beginning to end.
That's really helpful. Oh, why does J.C. Ryle's work continue to be so influential?
Well, I think there are a couple of reasons that it continues to be influential. One is that Ryle influenced people who then exercised a lot of influence. So I believe it was Martin Lloyd-Jones who was responsible for getting Holiness republished in the 1950s, excuse me. And if you look at, think about influential ministers, both Anglican and non-Anglican, in the last 50 years, and whenever they give an interview or an article saying, "Oh, these are the books that influenced me most," I mean, Ryle is almost always on my list. From J.I. Packer, who was deeply influenced by Ryle and then in turn influenced many others, to even more influential ministers today. So I think on the one hand, Ryle influenced influential people, and they in turn point people back to Ryle. But on another level, and probably more significant level, Ryle's writings are in some sense timeless. They capture timeless biblical truths. They capture timeless Protestant truth, timeless Puritan truth. And what Ryle's real contribution is, he's not an innovator in any sense. I mean, think about the title of his book, Old Paths. He's not trying to do anything new, but what he does, and he does so well, is that he takes and distills biblical truth, Protestant truth, Puritan truth, and repackages it and distills it for audiences with incredible, simple, clear, straightforward language. And so that, I think, more than anything else, is why he sticks around. Because, if the Puritans are right and their take on the Christian life is actually the way the New Testament describes it, I can think of nobody better to describe Puritan spirituality and thus biblical spirituality than Ryle, because it was such simplicity, such clarity. If the Puritans, if the Protestants were right about the way justification works and the way God justifies sinners, Ryle does a phenomenal job of explaining justification to people in modern, simple, forceful, clear English. So I think his clarity as a theologian, his style of writing, plus I think the influence of his ministry, and I think he exerted a tremendous personal influence in his own day, and I think that even his personal character continues to influence others down through the ages. So those would be the three things I would think. He influenced influencers. He's a phenomenal communicator of timeless truth, and his personal example has inspired Christians and ministers since his passing in 1900.
Yeah, I think that's really good. How can J.C. Ryle's crucified style preaching help pastors grow in their own preaching today?
Well, if you find yourself as a preacher like Ryle did back in 1844, where you have a hard time keeping the attention of your congregation, then Ryle's experiments, his pulpit experiments, as that's what he called them, I think can really help you learn to grab and keep people's attention. So for the last few months, I've been introducing and editing a new edition of his book, Simplicity in Preaching, a few hints on a great subject. And that's really Ryle's, this is how I did it, right? I mean, he wrote that in 1882, and that timing is really important, because Ryle has just become bishop of this massive diocese that has so many people, so few ministers, and he wants to teach his ministers how to get and hold people's attention. And if you want to learn to get and hold people's attention, well, learn from Ryle. Simplicity in Preaching is a phenomenal book about how to do that. And again, I think, one of the things teaching middle schoolers, it's one thing to know theology well. It's one thing to know biblical theology well. But I think, can you communicate that simply and clearly to a middle schooler? That's really a really interesting test, or it has been for me. And my study with Ryle has helped me, I think, as somebody who teaches young people 5 days a week during the school year, to be simple, to strive for simplicity and clarity in my teaching, not to make things confusing, but to make them simple, straightforward, easy to grasp, therefore easy to respond to.
Well, I think that Ryle is really instructive for the reason that you're saying, because earlier you were even talking about the way that he writes, simply and clear and those kind of things, and in plain language. And I would argue that that is our need today. We have all sorts of people that are, the statistics tell us that they don't understand what they believe and why it matters. They don't see the connection between their convictions in their daily life and more.
Sure.
So if you're a writer out there and want to really make a difference in people's lives for the kingdom, write in plain language for the average person in the pew, and I'm telling you, God will use you. I say that as an editor, and I know it. That's the way I want to write books. I want to write books for the average person in the pew, because they're probably the most neglected audience in the church today. I know that's a large claim to make, but in terms of what I mean is sound doctrine, biblical doctrine, rich, in Protestant Reformational theology that they're neglected. So we need more writing and writers writing for the average person in the pew with sound theology in mind.
Absolutely. Yeah, and Ryle so helpful there. One of the things I did in the book is that I compared Charles Spurgeon, John Henry Newman, who's a very prominent high churchman who then became a Roman Catholic, who now I think is in the process of being canonized, by the way, and Ryle. They all preached on John 11. The resurrection of Lazarus, and I did a rhetorical comparison of their sermons. And one of the things that I found is that John Henry Newman averaged 30 words a sentence. Charles Spurgeon averaged about 24. Ryle averaged 15. So here's someone who is phenomenally gifted at saying a lot in very short, compact, tight sentences. And I think if you look at my preaching from before I started the study on Ryle, and you look at it now, I'm willing to bet that I don't know if it's better, and I don't know if it's clear, but I do know that my sentences are shorter. And I've tried to speak and to write with fewer but better chosen words, as opposed to just overwhelming my congregation or my reader with long, drawn-out sentences with dependent clause after dependent clause. And Ryle helped me with that. I don't know if I'm any good at it, but I'm certainly striving to be more clear and direct like Ryle was.
Well, the fact that you're growing and continuing to grow in that is a good thing. I mean, that's all we can do is keep growing and keep honing our craft and growing in the grace of God. So those are good things. How did J.C. Ryle deal with controversy, and how can his example instruct Christians to handle controversy today?
Well, I think we live in a day when we are tempted to almost throw up our hands, say, "Woe is me," because it seems like every few years a new theological controversy comes along, and any of us think, "Oh goodness, another one." Like, think about the times in which Ryle lived. Right? He was born in 1816 and died in 1900. He lived to see the emergence of Anglo-Catholicism or ritualism. He dealt with that. He lived to see the rise of Darwin and Darwinism, 1859. He lived to see the emergence of higher criticism of the Old Testament in the 1860s with essays and reviews. He literally lived through so much controversy, and that's just kind of the big one. I mean, there's all sorts of small ones about what ministers should wear. That's kind of a Church of England issue, but it was related to ritualism and to the symbolism behind it. He got involved in disestablishment controversy between dissenters and churchmen. He was involved in all sorts of things. But if you kind of were to take his controversial writings against the ritualists, against the Neologians, those who would deny the inspiration and the inerrancy of the Old Testament, or even the Catholic spirituality, which is what gave birth to Holiness, you'll see there, I think, two things. You'll see a pastor's heart. So he's always concerned with how what you believe affects the way you live for the Lord and affects your growth in grace. But I also think you also see just what does this mean for Christ? How does this impact Christ? So if you were to look at his critique of auricular confession, he could say many things historically. He could point to the reformers and some of their, and he does from time to time, but his big issue with auricular confession is that it puts another mediator between Christ and a heavy-laden sinner. Like, if you look at his critique of the real presence, I mean, there's so much Protestant theology that he could look back to, and he does, but he's really concerned with if the doctrine of the real presence is true, then that destroys the humanity of Christ, or the real humanity of Christ. If eternal punishment, that's another issue he dealt with. If eternal punishment is not true, if immortality is conditional, how does that impact the work of Christ and its sufficiency, and also consequently how does that reflect upon the sinfulness of sin and the lengths that God had to go to through Christ to atone for it. And even Catholic theology or Catholic spirituality, which occasions holiness, as you look through his critique of that in certain places in that book, you'll see that their view of sin is too low. And if your view of sin is too low, then that will lower your view of Christ as well. So I think as we think about Ryle's engagement and the plethora of controversies that he was involved in, it always comes down to two issues: pastoral concern and Christological concern, or pastoral concern and concern to maintain the honor of glory of Christ and the integrity of the gospel at the same time.
That's really good. Really, really well said.
Thank you.
Well, J.C. Ryle's classic work on holiness is hugely influential, as we've talked about. How can J.C. Ryle's teaching on sanctification help Christians today?
Wow, we could do a whole podcast on this. Like you said, you've read it many times, and many people who I meet that like Ryle, that's the one book they've read over and over and over again. I think as what holiness does, again, Ryle's not doing something new. Look at the footnotes in your book. He is quoting and citing Puritan author after Puritan author after Puritan author after Puritan author. So what Ryle does in part one is he basically presents us. Holiness was originally published in two parts. Part one, which I think was the first 7 chapters of the book, and then part two, which are all those sermons on the back half, in the back end. And what he's doing there in the first half is kind of defining biblical spirituality, biblical sanctification for us. And he's borrowing heavily from the Puritans and to some degree from the Reformers. And then after that, you have all these sermons. And if you read through them, you'll start to discern patterns, right? The first few sermons there are about examples of holiness, right? You'll have Lot's wife, who is a negative example. That chapter, more than anything else, stands out to me. I mean, I can remember where I was when I first read that, because I was stunned and convicted and a bit scared based on the example of Lot's wife, which is exactly what I think he's supposed to do. It's supposed to shake us up and cause us, as Jesus said, to remember Lot's wife and the error she made and not to follow in her footsteps. But then he kind of works through positive examples as well, and kind of moves on through a number of issues. But when you think about, more than anything, holiness helps us calibrate ourselves to the Christian life. One of the things in ministry I'm sure you've encountered and I've encountered are people often get discouraged in the Christian life because they have false expectations. They think things, after becoming a Christian, they expect, in one sense, a life of peace and ease. Well, one of the chapters in the early chapters of holiness is fight. Right? Ryle calls us to anticipate in the Christian life not peace and ease, but a fight, which is nothing different than what Peter tells us in 1 Peter. Don't be surprised when the fiery trial comes upon you. It's necessary. It's normal. That's normal Christian life. And so I think what holiness does is it helps us calibrate ourselves to biblical expectations about living the Christian life. This is what it is. This is how it begins. This is how it progresses. This is what you'll meet with. These are the struggles you'll face. These are some of the hindrances, the difficulties of it, and here's some helps along the way. And I think Christians that's resonated with believers for hundreds of years, or for the last 100 years. And that was one of the problems with Keswick theology that occasioned the book in the first place. Ryle looks at it, and as he thinks through what they're teaching, they're saying that if you have this second sort of conversion experience, you can be totally consecrated to God, and you can live free from all known sin for weeks and months and years. So I think that's what I think drove J.I. Packer. It really gave him a hard time. And so the mortification of sin and holiness helped deliver him from these false expectations, because he wondered, well, if you can be delivered completely from all known sin, then why am I not being delivered from it? He's sensitive to his conscience and listens to it. He knows he sins. Why can't he essentially live in an unbroken communion with God? And that book, I think, helped him and helped others, helped me, perhaps helped you, calibrate your heart, your soul, your expectations to what the Christian life really is and will be, as opposed to kind of fanciful versions of what it's not.
Yeah, that's really well said. One thing that stood out to me in reading it is there's a lot of Christians that struggle, as you know, no doubt, with assurance. And what he talks about assurance is just so helpful. And I'm not sure if this is direct quote or whatever, Dave's paraphrase, or probably Dave's paraphrase, but he talks about, if there's even the tiniest of sliver of growth and grace, you can have assurance of your salvation. And
sure.
I think that is just so helpful, because we tend to think, well, if there's not this amount of assurance, or if not this amount of growth in grace over time, and he is talking about time over time, so he's taking a long view of sanctification, that, you can have assurance of your salvation if there's even the tiniest sliver. And I think that that's really instructive, because we have people that think, well, I've done X number of thing in my Christian life, and so God no longer loves me. And we have people that don't understand the difference between, and let me spell this out just a little bit here, the difference between our security in Christ, where Paul talks about that over and over again in Romans 8:31 through 39, and the difference between our fellowship with God being broken because of our sin. Now we know that our security in Christ is we're completely and totally secure because of the finished and sufficient work of Christ. But our fellowship with God, it can be broken. That's why we have to confess our sin. That's why we need to daily repent of our sin. And that's why I think that J.C. Ryle is so important, because he helps us to begin to think in these biblical categories about, we think, well, we live in this culture that is so fast, and we can go to McDonald's and Jack in the Box and Hardee's and go through our food, and so get our food, and so we microwave our spirituality in the same way. And when J.C. Ryle says things like, if there's even the tiniest sliver of growth in grace, that actually should be tremendously encouraging to us, because it helps us to see it as God does, taking the long view of salvation through our whole life, not just in this moment.
Sure. Well, in that book, one of the things that struck me when I went through it is that, as dealing with assurance, he said that Christians can have assurance not just by their victories, but by their conflict, by the fact that they are fighting sin, by the fact that they are bothered by their lack of progress, and that there is an inward conflict going on. I mean, I would say those are evidences too. But perhaps my favorite chapter of the whole book is the last one, which is titled "Christ is All." So you have in that book, you have the objective grounds of our assurance as strongly affirmed as the more subject as well. And so it's such a well balanced book. So you found it helpful. I found it helpful. So many people have for these reasons. It's just pastorally sensitive, but it also challenges too. And that's one of the things, especially when I've taught it to others. I like the fact that Ryle isn't merely describing holiness and what it looks like, but he's summoning us to it, and he's challenging us to pursue it more faithfully, more fervently, and in helpful and biblical ways, and not in unhelpful and unbiblical ways. So it's a masterpiece. In many respects, I think it's the Pilgrim's Progress stated propositionally.
That's really well said. Do we again need men like J.C. Ryle, and what would they look like in terms of their character and ministry?
Well, the answer, I think, is yes. We certainly do need more men like J.C. Ryle. What their ministry would look like, I think, first of all, Ryle, we've been talking about holiness, he would say your character matters most, and who you are as a disciple, as a believer, as someone who loves and trusts the Lord matters far more than your success does, or your outward success. So I think if the Lord would raise up more men like J.C. Ryle, I think they would be men who pursue holiness wholeheartedly. And they would do so in a very simple, ordinary way. And if you read Holiness or other books, Ryle is not calling us to go to a revival service. He's not calling us to go to mass meetings. In fact, Ryle was saying holiness, but it's far easier to be a Christian in a mass meeting than it is to be an ordinary means of grace believer. One who faithfully attends church, one who's faithfully devoted to prayer, to Bible reading. I mean, just look at the opening chapters of Practical Religion or Old Paths. I mean, they're calling believers to a very regular, ordinary, but outstanding thing. Devotion to Christ in His Word, devotion to the Lord in prayer, regular church attendance, participating in the sacramental life of the church, just normal, tried and true sorts of means of grace ministry. So I think on one hand, Ryle would raise the Lord. If the Lord were raising up more Ryles, I think that would be evident by raising up men and ministers and regular ordinary believers whose spiritual diet consists of large helpings of ordinary means of grace. Worship, preaching, the Bible, prayer, Christian fellowship, memorizing Scripture, the regular celebration of the Lord's Supper, those sorts of things. Now, if the Lord raised up men of that character, what might their ministries look like? Well, I think that they would be ministries that would be focused on a simple means of grace approach to the Christian life and relying on those for growth and health in life. So I think that would be kind of another piece of that. One of the most outstanding, one of the things that about Ryle that's so evident when you get to know him better is that he was a controversialist. He did speak the hard issues, but he did so in remarkable ways. So one of the things that I'm amazed about the more I get to know Ryle is that Ryle was often criticized by name in other people's publications. So I like Spurgeon, but in The Sword and the Trowel, Spurgeon will call out Ryle by name and attack him by name over disestablishment controversy, things like that, right? Others will write things about him, will publish letters against him or works in response to him. Well, one of the things about Ryle's controversial writings is that you'll almost never see a name of an opponent unless he's praising them. So he's not a personal attacker. He is constantly addressing ideas. And, I think of, he interacted with one ritualist named Frederick Littledale, but he praises him. He says, look, I totally disagree with Littledale. All my readers will know this, but I thank Reverend Littledale for getting to the heart of the matter, right? He was very forthright in presenting his criticism of reformers. That's what doing. And so he appreciated that he didn't, mince words and got right to it. So I thought Ryle had a remarkable ability to be involved in controversy and to write controversial things, but to do so in a way that didn't attack other people. Even as he was being attacked by name by others. So if you think about what a modern Ryle might look like, a man of holiness, a man of a normal means of grace ministry, but also someone who wasn't afraid to address the pressing spiritual and theological issues of the day, but would do so in a bold, in a faithful, but also in a godly and impersonal sort of way. And I think that if you look at Victorian polemics, they often descend into name-calling, things like that. Ryle manages to stay above it, even though nobody evangelical Anglicans that I'm aware of gets attacked more than does during his lifetime in those sorts of ways. I mean, he married and buried 3 wives during his lifetime. And even as a bishop, his opponents were kind of making fun of, which husband would he be in heaven, that sort of thing, it's a really low blow. But he stayed above the fray in that way. So that's what I think. I think he would, men who are devoted to holiness, men who are devoted to means of grace ministry, men who are concerned about the health of the church and respond to controversy, but do so in a God-honoring way and don't dishonor the Lord through personal attacks and just ungodly behavior as they do it.
Yeah, that's really well said. Well, Ben, as we wrap up this conversation, and it's been a really good one so far, can you give us a few takeaways about J.C. Ryle that you would have for our listeners?
Sure. Well, I would commend Ryle to you. I think his life is deeply instructive. I would commend his works to you. I think that they're solid, they're valuable, they're health-giving, life-giving, they're Christ-honoring. I'm more and more impressed with Ryle as a communicator, and I think as someone who preaches and teaches regularly, there's so little time in my life, and perhaps in yours as well, to actually work on communication and to work on becoming a better preacher, a better writer, a better speaker, a better teacher. I think Ryle just has a lot to help. I think he can help us today quite a bit by looking at not just reading his writings for your own soul, which you should do, but also reading them as a model of clear communication, and also a holy boldness. I mean, one of the things that makes Ryle so distinct is that he never says we or us or things like that. He's always writing you, because that's what he means. He's addressing the reader as an individual you with individual sins who needs Christ to rescue them from the power and penalty of sin individually. And so I think that as a communicator, he has a lot to teach us. Of course, as a theologian, I think if you're going to encourage someone to study the Puritans, Ryle, especially a young person maybe who might stumble over some of the language of a John Owen or even a John Bunyan at certain points, Ryle's just a great entry to spirituality in an easily readable form. I think those would be the big takeaways. Communicate. He's good for your soul. He's good for your practice of ministry as a communicator.
Yeah, I agree. Especially the boldness part. I mean, what you said is throughout is really helpful. But I'm just reminded of just how bold he is in sharing his faith. He's not concerned with what other people think per se, although he is, he obviously loves people and says it because he loves, God and truth, but and people, but just his holy boldness, as you said, that's just so well said. And Ben, I really appreciate the time that you've given to me to talk about J.C. Ryle. I'm a huge fan of him. Your book, Tender Lion, The Life, Ministry and Message of J.C. Ryle is very well written, and I would commend it to our listeners. So thank you so much for your time today, brother.
Well, thank you. I've enjoyed talking to you about Ryle and his works and his life.
Thank you so much for listening. We hope that you were encouraged by today's episode. Don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review wherever you get your podcast. For more uplifting and thought-provoking content, please visit us online at servantsofgrace.org. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Servants of Grace, and on Facebook at facebook.com/servantsofgrace. We hope you have a blessed day, and we will see you next time.